This is the Midi Fighter Twister, and these are not your average knobs. The knobs on the Midi Fighter Twister are incredibly powerful. Not only can you configure them to be whatever you want, but you configure each knob so that when you press a knob, it does a completely different function depending on how you want it to control things. This makes using it for software like Ableton Live in your studio or on stage amazingly powerful. Let me walk you through 4 different ways you can customize a single knob on the Midi Fighter Twister to do really simple but very powerful things. First of all, a knob can either control a standard control like EQ, where you get a continuous range, or it can be configured to be more like a filter, which will display left and right. In this case, I'm using it to control pan. Underneath this knob, I've got one set to adjust the level of my EQ. So a very common scenario is I'm going through and I'm trying to find negative frequencies that I want to cue out. So let's go through our frequency range, see if we can't find something. Now here's the first powerful thing you can do. You can customize the knob so that when you press it down, you get something called fine control. This is possible in the Midi Fighter utility. I'll select the knob and change what I want to do with the switch. In this case, I'm selecting encoder fine adjust. That means that normally the knob controls a very wide range. But if I hold it down, it now controls a very narrow range, allowing me to really fine tune and find those specific frequencies. Already it's sounding a lot better. Now on this encoder's switch, I've customized it in the software to be CC toggle. So it's sending out a regular toggle note that I can use to turn my EQ on or off, so I can A/B. Now, one of the other really amazing things about these knobs is if you've got one mapped to something like the filter, which does not have a wet-dry control, and you don't want to turn the filter off, how do you reset the value really quickly without turning it all the way back down? Well, it's very simple. In the Midi Fighter utility, I've configured this switch to reset encoder value. So when I press the button, it just resets the encoder back to 0. This is really handy for effects like filters and delays and reverbs. The final thing you can configure these knobs to do is really, really interesting and very powerful. It allows you to have 2 knobs on one. So right now I've got this guy mapped to wet-dry in my reverb, pretty standard. But what if I also want to adjust the size of the room? Well, there's an option for that. On this particular encoder, I've configured it to shift encoder hold. So it's shifting up to another value when I'm holding it down. And I've mapped that value to my decay time. So I like that, and then I go right back, and I've got my wet-dry. Maybe turn down the wet-dry, turn up the decay time, and then turn up the wet-dry. So those are 5 very simple but extremely powerful ways you can configure the Midi Fighter Twister so they don't become just your average knobs.